Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of March 15th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the same Texas Politics Project. Josh, how rested are you today?
Getting there. What's the scale?
1 to 7.
5. I'll take a 5.
Okay, that's not bad.
Yeah.
7 being most rested.
Right. I don't know if I'm ever a 7 since I had kids.
Yeah,
but...
I haven't been a 7 in years.
It's been almost a decade, but yeah.
Right. So today we want to look at a couple of things. One is the unfolding political response to last month's storm-related power outages, which is taking an enormous amount of bandwidth in the Texas Legislature and Texas politics, and in particular the financial issues that have arisen from that. And we'll go into that a little bit in a minute. And then if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about the context of the public rollout of the much anticipated and quote unquote election integrity push in the legislature that Governor Abbott declared an emergency item and has multiple sponsors in the legislature, and how that is shaping up, particularly given that even though it's not a big surprise here in Texas, and certainly for people watching this, it seemed to have really, taken the national political media by storm, which is kind of interesting. But let's start with the politics of what is now Senate Bill 2142. And when we recorded this podcast last week, Senate Bill 2142 was, I think, nothing more at best than a gleam in the lieutenant governor's eye, if that.
Right. I don't even think it was a placeholder. It didn't exist.
The bill itself didn't exist, but I'm not sure exactly when they, if we recorded last Tuesday, they were probably cooking it up by then. Was a couple days later when the lieutenant governor made his big surprise appearance.
That's interesting. You think so? Because, if they were, don't you think they would have filed just a shell bill so as not to have to do what they did this week? We're kind of getting ahead of the game here. Sorry.
No, I don't, because I think that they were kind of, I think this has all been unfolding pretty quickly,
okay.
But,
continue. Sorry.
That's why I said I don't know. So, the headline around this for people that watch this is that it's brought some very open conflict between the governor and the lieutenant governor over what the lieutenant governor is pushing and his pose on this. So if we go back, to the fundamentals, the Senate this week very quickly introduced, had about a 20-minute committee hearing to cross that T and dot that I.
No public testimony.
With no public testimony, and then moved to the floor and passed basically all on the same day.
That's one way in which the COVID protocols make it easier.
Senate Bill 2142. And what the bill does is call for the PUC and ERCOT to, immediately, as the bill analysis puts it, to correct the prices of wholesale power and ancillary service that were sold in the ERCOT market during the period beginning 11:55 p.m. February 17th and ending 9 a.m. February 19th. So all of this has fallen out of the contracted external audit that said that there had been a massive amount of overbilling, I think $16 billion.
Well, they originally said $16 billion, and then they corrected it and said, well, it's probably closer to $4 billion. But it kind of says,
like a net for once you,
shake it all out
under pressure. But then they kind of walked that back a little bit too as this all unfolded. So, and just to be clear, and I think you have a much better grasp on this, the whole, a lot of aspects of this than I do. And so basically, my understanding is that, essentially ERCOT's in a situation, there's not enough energy production going on.
they went to the PUC and said, hey, we need to increase, the market cap price that we'll pay for energy to incentivize more energy production into the system. The PUC said yes. And then this bill, and then basically they let that go on for too long.
And that was Monday night.
And the idea is just to correct basically the point
Monday night of the shortage.
Right. And the idea here is to basically correct the market for the period after which it's been decided. I'm not saying this with any criticism, but after the fact that they should have readjusted the pricing at a certain point. They're basically saying to correct the pricing from then on.
Right. I mean, the competing narratives are, basically,
Yeah.
The PUC and ERCOT left the price, at the higher point for too long,
Right.
which resulted in, overbilling that now threatens to ripple through the system if, from the perspective of some people, in which, high bills were sent to electricity providers. They were probably higher than a lot of them had the rates they had contracted. And we've already seen, some financial difficulties. Even the degree of financial difficulties became a point of argumentation by the end of last week. But the idea being that you could go back and retroactively, and this is what the bill orders them to do, retroactively lower the price and then lower the price of the bills. And, at this point, if anybody's paid up, which they probably haven't, just readjust everything, which is going to redistribute the costs. And I've not heard, listen to every second of the hearings. I've also not heard about exactly, what the real, the quote unquote real market price would have been and how they would know that.
Well, and it also seems that there's also a clear debate about whether this can even really be done.
Right. I mean,
like from a legal, not that the legislature can't.
That gets to the point of the politics, right? Which is that the governor has said, as this idea was being floated last week, the governor pretty much went on the record, well, not pretty much, he went on the record saying that, his reading of the Constitution as a former judge and former attorney general was that there were provisions, that there were provisions of the Constitution that forbade, this, in part because it would be, essentially voiding pre-existing contracts.
It's like an ex post. Yeah, exactly.
And so the lieutenant governor and many of his allies, the movement on this bill and the movement for some kind of action on this had a lot of support in the Senate.
It passed 27-3, I think.
Yeah, I think all but 3 senators, signed on a letter saying that their charges should be reversed.
And I think it's 27-3 and 1 abstention because it was, I think, Kelly Hancock, who's the chair of the relevant committee, I believe, was his rationale.
Yeah, and although he provided more of a rationale, which is that he, aside from the chair thing, he came out, I think, in the last day or two and said that he had substantive objections as well. So. And that itself was another little, eddy of this whole thing. So, I thought that, what was interesting for, the kind of things that we've been talking about here is that the politics of this have moved very quickly in the sense that, last week when Lieutenant Governor Patrick showed up in a very highly unusual appearance to question the chair and last man standing at the PUC because the other 2 members have resigned about this. It was a very combative appearance in which he accused the PUC chair of lying about a couple of things, accused him of being incompetent, reminded him that he was Governor Abbott's appointee, and sent very clear signals to Governor Abbott that he thought Governor Abbott should make a declaration, in support of this approach, even though the governor has been on the record and went on the record again after this saying he would not do that.
I liked,
or was not in favor of that.
I love that. Just as I find all this entertaining to me, all this, politics just generally, otherwise we wouldn't do this. But Abbott's response to that was just I thought was kind of great in some ways, which was, the legislature can legislate on this and somebody's going to need to implement what you legislate. Somebody's still got to be there. In
essence, it kind of, it amounted, at least in part, to, I've already said the legislature should do something, but not this. So, in the implicit, people spent the weekend in the eddy of a very familiar, and to my mind, I don't know, I shouldn't say strange because I get it. A very familiar round of speculation about what the lieutenant governor's motivation was. Did this mean the lieutenant governor was, going to challenge the governor in the Republican primary? Speculation on Twitter, in print, wherever people were getting together, many of them probably unmasked, giving the people we're talking about,
right,
to discuss these things over the weekend. And then, Monday came and, which would be yesterday as we record this. And then the Senate did this, super sped up, again, very unorthodox version in which they had to, work on the legislative, had to define the legislative day as last Thursday and reverse the clock. And we've seen that before, but doesn't happen every day.
Usually when we
every Monday, every Monday does not become the previous Thursday in the legislature.
When we go back in time in the legislature, it's kind of unusual.
Yeah, usually it's a flag that there's something going on, and
time travel.
The bill sailed through with relatively minimal debate. And then the person we haven't talked about here is the Speaker of the House, who early on, as this was being discussed, had sent very much a kind of tap the brakes signal about what his approach and what he thought the House approach should be, which was, yes, something needs to be done, but we need to consider it. And at one point, I think early last week, or maybe even late the week before, he had said, and, this could probably wait. This could even wait till a special session when we had time to give it the attention it deserves. So what you have is, people in very different positions on this. And I think it underlines, things that we've been talking about for years, which is that there's always been this behind the scenes tension between the governor and the lieutenant governor, that they've done a pretty good job of not letting out into the open.
Mm-hmm.
Although almost anybody you talk to inside assumes this is a fact of life.
Yeah. I've been trying, this is interesting. I mean, you've already alluded, if not directly stated, the fact that this is sort of a consistent kind of frame, really, about how, I think a lot of people think about the internal politics of the legislature, this idea of some sort of a competition, between either the governor, the lieutenant governor, or the lieutenant governor and the governor, depending on how you look at it and all that kind of stuff. And, my kind of first reaction to that is it just sort of feels lazy in this moment. I mean, it's there and it's kind of easy, but I mean, Patrick, to your point, Patrick came out after
lazy on their part or lazy on the part of people interpreting it?
Lazy on the part of people interpreting it.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's a lazy frame at this point. I mean, I'm not saying that Dan Patrick there's 0% chance he would challenge Greg Abbott in a Republican primary for governor. I mean, look, a lot of things can happen between now and then, but it seems like a pretty low probability situation. And I mean, even to the point where, again, Patrick unprompted basically came out on, I think it was Monday or Tuesday and said, and said, I'm not running against the governor. Okay, guys. He's trying to, Now that doesn't mean I believe
he felt prompted. He felt prompted by our friend Ross Ramsey's article in the Texas Tribune.
Well, and that's the point. He felt prompted by a weekend of coverage that framed what he was trying to do, I think, in a way that, I just think, again, I think it's kind of lazy, in some ways. I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on here that I could point to that I think are more, telling in terms of style, in terms of representational government, and in terms of other things that probably point to where these guys are coming from, and also the process itself. Now, none of those might be right. I'll just say that, but they're more complicated.
You could be wrong too.
Oh, I could totally be wrong, but they're more complicated than this whole, Dan Patrick is trying to make Greg Abbott look bad. It's like, I don't think so. I think there's some complications in there in terms of trying to make sure that the blame lands somewhere that's not either of those two. And I think they're both trying to make sure that that's the case. But they're also following styles that I think are pretty well worn for them in some ways, and they have different incentive structures, right? So just a couple things, and I'll, you can go and say, I don't agree with you on that or whatever, But I mean, to some degree, right now, I think the thing about this issue in general is that, obviously it's sucking up a ton of oxygen because constituents are mad, legislators are hearing about it. It's an issue, So when there's an issue like that, I think, politicians want to act. It's their job to respond to constituent concerns. That makes a lot of sense, right? just on its face, I would say, Greg Abbott's approach to some degree, setting aside the responsibility question for a second, has been like, kind of the way he is about a lot of things, which is to be, a mixture of both, political but selective, right? And how he approaches these things. Dan Patrick is still a bit of a shock jock, right? I mean, we're still, and what am I talking about here? What I'm talking about is that what happened with the blackout was a complicated systemic failure writ large, I would say. And the system was designed by the legislature and approved by politicians in the state for years and not really improved upon. Ultimately, a lot of the actions of the last few days seem, to my mind, to be focused on really shifting the blame to individual failings, whether that be Bill Magnus at ERCOT, whether that be the PUC members, whether that be the out-of-state board members, and basically saying, somebody messed this up. Somebody really made a mistake here. And what we're doing is we're cleaning house. I'm making action, and we're going to do something. We're going to change this. Because honestly, that's more salient and tangible to like ordinary people and voters than is something that adjusts, the way, a specific function of the way that the energy market, which is pretty complicated in Texas, works. So that's like one aspect of it. I'll put that out there. I don't know if, if you.
Well, I think as far as that goes, all those things are in play. I mean, certainly, almost from, before the crisis was even over,
mm-hmm.
The governor was sending the signal that they, we can just say it. I mean, they were fitting Bill Magnus and the PUC and ERCOT
mm-hmm.
for the blame for all this, and push that message pretty consistently, for as long as they could until, the first round of legislative hearings when the PUC sort of got dragged into the picture and Abbott didn't have the leverage, the governor didn't have the leverage in the process to protect the PUC. And I think importantly, and this is, I think, what I would add to that explanation is something I think we talked about last week or week before, and we talked about this, and that's if you look in the interest group universe and, the tectonics of the Republican Party, protection of the Railroad Commission and accommodating the role that oil and gas played in this, and that, still remains kind of out of the frame in a lot of these discussions.
And I think that's the thing. And I think that's when I say that the whole, well, this is Abbott, or this is, Patrick trying to kneecap Abbott, is a lazy frame. Because that's exactly, there's so much coalitional elements in here that are really at play.
Well, right. And so I'm just adding the coalitional elements.
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing. I'm
really the piece.
Yeah, and I'm agreeing with you. I think that's the point is why,
I think, and I think so that said, I think, the interesting thing that, your kind of analysis, I don't know that I don't know that I'd go so far as lazy, because I think that, it gets at an element that I think you see at all levels within the Capitol and at the system, is that, if you're trying to get something done in the Capitol, this is a factor,
mm-hmm.
whether the lieutenant governor and the governor are on the same page or not, how the ongoing jockeying for position and how their calculations have been, have affected each other mutually, is kind of an unavoidable part of the topic if you're of playing the game, if you're doing anything. And so I think, I think I wouldn't say lazy so much as just reflexive.
But what I would say is that better described as, an individual conflict between two politicians, or as an institutional conflict between a governor who's been given a lot of power for a long period of time now over the year of COVID, and a legislature that hasn't really been able to act, but now faced with, this clearly salient, this other clearly salient crisis in terms of, energy. Patrick could say, well, I can act. And he showed it. Now again, the House element to this is another question, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent, go ahead.
But what I would say is that, yes, the institutional piece of this, is the thing that people tend to underestimate systematically in this when they get really up into because it's easier to parse it out as an individual conflict. But the individual piece matters. It's hard to imagine just to, to think, to switch, to control for the human variable here. Hard to imagine David Dewhurst trying something like this when he was lieutenant governor. Very different personal approach to this, very similar, somewhat similar institutional position. Now, Patrick is more powerful for some of the coalitional popular.
Well, and I'd also say he's more powerful in
both elite and voting base, but also there's a personal part of that is that he just, he occupies the lieutenant governorship much more fully than his predecessor.
Well, but and that's overt, but that's also overt, right? I mean, and also in response to, right? I mean, that's the thing. And so it is still an institutional thing. I mean, ultimately,
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to.
Yeah. No.
If you don't want to change your mind, that's fine. But, but Dan Patrick and David Dewhurst and the personalities involved there, and Greg Abbott versus even Perry, and the personages there and their position, their political positions are rooted in these institutional and coalitional politics. But it's hard, but I mean, I guess I'm just sort of giving, some people that are observing this the benefit of the doubt in noting that, the personal strategies, as much as they're determined by all this structural and institutional stuff, are a factor here. And I think that, as you were describing Abbott's strategy earlier, I mean, some of those factors seeped into that explanation, right? I mean, kind of characteristically Abbott, kind of parsing this and parsing that. So some of that is at work. To me, I mean, what really crystallizes, for me and how you kind of, how I kind of divide all these different, factors that are, obviously just like the electric thing. I mean, you've got two layers of real complex, multidimensional systemic layers on top of each other. You've got the market piece, the electrical piece, which is very complicated and systemically complicated, as you describe, which I think is absolutely right. Then you've got this, weirdo institutional sort of design in Texas. These things tend to have pretty over-determining forces, but I think that, a reporter asked me yesterday, so, this is really all just about Patrick, wanting power, right? And, I think on one hand, that's, sort of grossly oversimplified.
I'd say on one hand, all of politics, but let's just pause
and not
for
right.
a second.
Yeah. And, obviously a little too general. On the other hand, there is something to the fact that, Patrick has proven to be much more interested in maximizing the power of his office than his predecessor was. Now, it used to be right after, Patrick got elected, I thought that contrast really mattered because so many of the players were doing compare and contrast. And I think that actually that helped Patrick early on. I think it's not as much of a factor now because he's been there a while and there's turnover and, people have short memories and there's not that many people going, David Dewhurst never would have done that.
Yeah, but
I still think it's useful to make the contrast because it does give you a sense of what's similar, what's different. And Perry was a much more powerful governor at that, particularly later in the point.
And I'm not arguing that the personalities don't make difference or that there isn't, some sort of a struggle here. But to me, the struggle has always been over, basically credit claiming more so than anything else. I mean, if I'm thinking about that relationship, setting Dewhurst aside, Patrick came in guns a-blazing and, really ramped it up. In terms of I remember when Patrick, started and it was like, here are my 30 agenda items. We're going to do a press conference. This is what's happening. 2017 goes out, tries to roll over the House with the bathroom bill, among other things. Then gets pretty serious. Not only does Abbott, maneuver around all that incredibly well, with the special session, basically at the end gets to say, hey, look at all these things I had the legislature do, but also the stuff they didn't do, man, they messed up. You have a really close election cycle. And then Patrick's been pretty, for Patrick, since if you compare those first two sessions to the most recent session and even the beginning of this one, people were commenting about, hey, where's Patrick? Patrick's so quiet. And obviously he's oriented himself slightly differently. Maybe he's older, maybe he's calmer. I don't know. But it's a different thing. But ultimately, I think what they're both looking for in some ways is still, the ability to claim credit for what happened. Now, if that's the same thing as saying they're trying to take each other's job or they're looking to get more power or whatever, I guess so. But I've never, I've been less enamored with with the office argument of this.
It still begs the question of claiming credit to what end.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unless credit is the end, unto itself. And I think that's still an open. I think it's an open question with the lieutenant governor, and I think with both of them, they both want to at least, you would think, at least stay where they are and not lose ground. And that does, it does raise a matter again. This is institutional in the way that you're talking about. There's a certain, inevitability. There's friction built into the institutional design here.
Right.
And that's why, if we think about the governors, when governors have been successful, at maximizing both, whatever their credit claiming to whatever end that credit claiming goes, it's been governors that have orchestrated cooperation or been orchestrated by the governor and the lieutenant governor. Right. So, the most successful sessions have been where that, where everybody came out feeling like they got something is when those things happened.
Yeah.
You think about the big transportation and water sessions, obviously the preeminent example that, I hate using, but, is still, the one, the most preeminent example of, the last generation or so, a little more than a generation now, I guess, is George W., the Bush, Laney, Bullock thing. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways that underlines the complexity of all the stuff we've been trying to untangle and going back and forth with here now. I mean, did that happen because, we were in a party transition and Bush was a less deeply conservative Republican than what we think of as the modal Republican now? Did it happen because, Laney and Bullock were less liberal Democrats than we have now? Is it, how much of that was the three of them? Somebody that I've talked to about this always says all the time, Laney and Bullock took Bush and they rocked him like a baby. And the next thing he was president.
Right. Just something like hearing you talk about this. I mean, the one thing that's, that sort of strikes me in this is, I wonder if the thing about this issue is, and where the tension comes from, is not about, power per se or about, someone trying to get to a different office. But I think part of it, there's a tension here because there's blame. Blame has to go somewhere. And ultimately, I think, if in a really simple analysis, you say Patrick is really focused on getting the people Abbott appointed out of there. Now, the fact that I could put Abbott appointed in parentheses. It's kind of not really necessarily the point here. And Abbott, not surprisingly, being where he is like, no, I want to keep the people that I trust or that are, and again, we've already cleaned house a lot. So let's just cool it. But, there's tension here. I mean, and the tension does come down to the blame, and then the credit claiming is sort of a separate piece. I mean, it kind of brings in, I think what it brings into all of this is the House also, which is, and then there's those guys who seem to have expressed no desire to move too quickly on any of this. And they're facing a different set of pressures. And I was trying to think about why that might be. And I've got and what's interesting about that, I think, is that, this is underlined the different natures of the House and the Senate right now, in this historical moment where, you don't, as the lieutenant governor, enunciated in very grateful and thankful terms at the end of the set, when the chamber had convened to pass the bill on Monday, this could not have happened without the will of the body. It was very gracious. But, as we've noted here before, the will of the body seems to be very much, driven by the lieutenant governor's boot and their collective behind, or some kind of, acquiescence to what is going, to what the lieutenant governor wants. Yeah.
You give him credit for having wrangled the Senate in that way, or, however you want to kind of, there are different, different partisan ways of thinking about that.
Can I give a cynical take?
Yeah, sure.
My cynical take is that, they're going to kick it to the House and it's going to sit there for a long time and come back completely different if it comes back at all. So one, the same way you're demonstrating action on this, you're doing it quickly and decisively. Ultimately, the content of what they do may or may not actually, ever really shake out specifically. And you can point fingers elsewhere.
I
and
don't
also,
think it's even.
as you pointed out,
Go ahead.
I mean, I'd say you've been watching, we've both been watching a bunch of hearings, I think partially if you're a senator with less members and the same agenda, I think you want to do something on this, but still open up some space. And this gives you some breathing room.
Yeah. And I think that, I don't think it's cynical. I mean, this would not be the first time, that somebody, that one chamber has passed a bill with the expectation that the other chamber would have to take responsibility for either killing it or for either killing it or changing it. I mean, this bill seemed written, I don't think it's cynicism. I think it would be naive to not see that. I mean, you look at the bill, the bill called for, its content to be implemented by this Saturday.
Yeah.
Which, puts the onus squarely on the House and then on the governor. And as Lieutenant Governor Patrick said in the press conference afterwards, in which he, on one hand, poo-pooed the absurd idea that he ever wants to challenge the governor for anything. Also, said, but it would also be very helpful if the governor would just signal to the House that he would sign the bill.
Right.
And that was the essence of what you're talking about. And that's, I think that's cynical. I mean, I think that's how, these guys work when, in the absence of this kind of perpetual conflict that we're talking about between both, the lieutenant governor and the House and the Senate. And we should say that as we record this, the bill's been sent over to the House. It has not had first reading as of today. It's been, the House has adjourned until tomorrow on Wednesday. So they can't read the bill and refer it to committee until tomorrow. If the will was there, they could still, theoretically, I think, pass the bill, get it to the governor's desk by Saturday. And then I guess that afternoon he can sign it that day. And that afternoon they'd come up with something. But the other piece of this, where I think the cynicism, where there is a fair accusation of cynicism, is that
against myself
or that is that the lieutenant governor has been, pretty clear in saying, I think there was a quote that's been circulating that I think was I'm not sure if it was from the press. I think it was from the press conference, which, it's not clear who the winners or losers are if they don't change the billing or if they do.
Right.
And that, I think, is a big, is a big tilt in the direction of going more slowly in the position that the House is going to take.
Right.
And, and I think the politics of that, are unknown. That's where, that's where the gambling comes in here.
Yeah.
Is Lieutenant Governor, right, quote unquote, that, the best thing to be able to do is to say you acted quickly and you took action for action's sake and for the sake of being able to say you did something that actually lowered people's bills, theoretically.
Maybe.
Or is, the better political play to say we took our time, we decided to do something, this is what we did. And, the lieutenant governor might go around in a primary saying, and some of the people that voted for that in the Senate saying we wanted to do something and other people obstructed us and they did this other thing. Will the other thing be sufficient? I don't think there's any way to know that right now. I think from a policy perspective, it's hard to argue for moving quickly more ignorantly. And by ignorantly, I don't mean to characterize the people as ignorant, but in the literal sense of, with very limited information where there's still, not very clear, many of the facts of the situation and many of the projections of what would be done are not clear.
Well, right. And I would argue, worse than not doing anything at all would be telling people you're going to do something for them and then have it not happen after you say you did. Right.
And then there is also, to lapse into the hoariest of cliches, HOAR. It does seem like in a situation there's been so much pain inflicted and so much has gone wrong, being guided by a principle of, to modify the cliche, do no more harm, seems to me to be the way to proceed. And I think that is not what we're seeing in the Senate, and we'll see what the pressure on the House is like. And, my if I had to predict right now, I think that this is, in terms of the unstable triad that is the big three, this creates a lot of incentives for the Speaker of the House and the governor to be on the same side and to box out the lieutenant governor, and to put tests to this discussion that we've had so many times, from podcasts to print to panels to over beers in my front yard. Just how powerful is Dan Patrick?
Yeah.
And I think this is going to be, yet another illustration. This is going to be more grist for that mill. But I will be very surprised if the House does what Dan Patrick wants in this, particularly given that the governor certainly doesn't seem to want to do this and certainly seems to want to do this a different way.
This is probably,
this is where, if we want to, and we won't, we did this in the weekly mailing that we send out. And if you'd like to get on that list, just shoot us an email. What is that email? What's our generic email address? We'll send you the email address before the podcast is over. But as we put in there, Greg, there's an ongoing debate right now over how much ground Greg Abbott has got. You and I haven't even talked about this. There was a Morning Consult poll that came out yesterday that suggested a decline in Abbott's approval. And if you look closely, his numbers got even more negative after he, at least in this one set of data, after he announced the mandate. Didn't seem that hurt by the outages, a little bit, but not a lot.
The important issue,
attrition among some Democrats, a lot of attrition among independents,
and that's the key.
And a little bit of a reduction in support, in the intensity of support, and a slight reduction in extent of support among Republicans. I mean, the independent thing, of course, I sort of sent something to somebody that's saying, look, independents move around a lot. You look at the multi-year trend in our data, and you can just see independent support of Abbott kind of moving. And I won't want to say constant. It's not erratic, but it fluctuates in waves.
Well, the point is it's not anchored by partisanship. So as you said, Republicans might be less approving of the governor for whatever reason after any number of things if they want to be, but they're not going to be disapproving. They might just not be strongly approving. Right. Democrats, they might increase their disapproval. You might see a few of them move from, like somewhat approval to don't know. But your point is right, which is independents are much more impacted by short-term forces because they're not attached to these things.
And which
and the headlines haven't been good.
And intuitively makes a lot of sense. These are people that don't, they don't have a lot of knowledge. They don't pay a lot of attention. The news gets bad. You ask them, if they want to blame the governor. It's like, yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, you got to blame somebody. Obviously, that's what we're learning.
Right. Which is, the underlying kind of, it goes back to the kind of some of the underlying dynamics here. Okay, we didn't get to elections this week, as you predicted, Josh.
I didn't think we would.
Where credit is due. But we will. But it wasn't like an act of nature. You had some influence over us not getting to it.
It's true.
So you were able to help to actualize your prediction.
I factored it in.
Yes, I think we call that planning.
Well, one of us has to do it.
So that'll do it for this week. I don't think the election topic is going to go away.
No.
So maybe we'll hit that next week. Did you find that email address?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a weird one. Right. No, I can. Well, this is a bad time to do it. Probably to search for an email address.
It's okay.
At the end of a podcast.
I won't. Well, actually, you can look it up while I'm doing the windup. So thanks to Josh for being here. We will, and thanks to our production staff in the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. We do have this mailing list that we send out all kinds of links to data, updates on the podcast. That email address is
texaspolitics@mail.laits.utexas.edu. So that's texaspolitics@mail.laits.utexas.edu.
So you can see why neither of us remembered it off the top of our heads. So thanks for listening to this Wandering podcast. Keep an eye on all these issues. Be safe and be well, and we will talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.